Today in the House of Commons, Labour will attempt to force the government to hand over 58 studies into the economic impact of Brexit on the UK. David Davis says MPs have already backed a decision not to release the papers, which he says would undermine Britain's negotiating position. Well, should those studies be released, joining me now is the Labour MP Stephen Kinnock, who campaigned to remain in the European Union, and the Conservative MP and Leave backer John Redwood. Welcome to you both. John Redwood, why shouldn't this information be made available to MPs or indeed to the public?
Well, I normally favour disclosure of information, but if the Brexit Secretary who's handling the negotiations tells me these particular papers would undermine our position, I will support him. And I find it very surprising that the Labour opposition is so openly wanting to undermine our position in difficult talks with the European Union. They said in the election they supported the wishes and decision of the British people, but since then they've done everything in their power to undermine Britain and bolster the position of the more extreme people in the European Union who want to take us for a ride.
But why would releasing information about official research undermine Britain's position?
Well, it probably points to things that we have to agree in the negotiations, and it may point to alleged weaknesses, because what we do know is the civil service in Britain have on the whole been of a Remain disposition, and they've thought it's their job to think up every conceivable problem and lots of inconceivable problems that might arise over Brexit. That's fine if it's internal, but it would be very silly to do that when many of us are very positive about Brexit, and we'd rather see papers on the opportunities, not the problems.
So you're undermining the government's negotiating position?
The government's position on this is completely untenable, because there have been some scientific research projects which have taken place, have gone into the 58 different sectors, and we need to know what the impact of a no-deal Brexit would be. We've been promised a meaningful vote in Parliament on the terms of the deal in October 2018. How can that vote possibly be meaningful if we're not given all the information and data that we need in order to make an informed choice? And I would also say this is about parliamentary sovereignty. I mean, I thought the idea behind the Leave campaign for the referendum was take back control. I thought that meant take back control to our sovereign parliament. It seems that the government seems to have a very selective approach to that, and what's clear is that the data in these reports demonstrates that the no-deal scenario is an absolute catastrophe for the British economy.
How do you know that?
Well, if that weren't the case, they'd be shouting them from the rooftops.
Yeah, but you don't have. You can't say that for sure.
No, but it's clear that, I mean, it doesn't take a genius to figure out that the government is trying to show that it could walk away from the negotiations. No problem, no deal, no problem. If that's the case, and these studies back that position up, then why not release them?
Well, no deal is the WTO option, which is a set of agreements through an international body that we belong to and the EU belongs to. And I think it's quite a high threshold. I do hope the government improves on it. But what it gives us is no more money to the EU from the day we leave, no control of the European Court of Justice, freedom to make our own trade deals, out of the single market and customs union, which is what we voted for as Leave voters.
You see, presumably,
and we will trade just fine under the WTO procedures.
I mean, you've expressed your opinion, and I know you know a lot about the economy, but nonetheless, we've now had these official studies. And, I mean, if you're right, these papers would back up your position on the
Not necessarily, because they may be wrong. Well, they often are. Remember the Treasury and Bank of England forecasts?
No,
they're completely wrong.
Surely it's information which MPs and the wider public need to see, because
I think
after all, the taxpayer is paying for this.
If we have an agreement and we have a debate on the agreement, I have no problem with it all being shown.
By the time we got an agreement, it's too late to know if it's covered this.
I mean, they really do want to damage any attempt to get an agreement and then complain that if we don't get an agreement. I mean, they really are having it both ways and doing down their voters, many of whom voted to leave.
How do we know that it would be damaging? I mean, surely the whole point of this is to have all the facts on the table so that we can understand what the impact of a no-deal Brexit looks like, and we can compare that to the deal that the government eventually manages to negotiate, if it manages to, because the approach is an utter shambles. I think we've got to take issue with John's position, because our duty as Her Majesty's loyal opposition is to hold the government to account. I thought that was the point
I understand
of take back control.
But I mean, the essential charge is really you want to undermine the negotiations in the hope that they presumably don't lead to an agreement, and that stops Britain leaving the EU.
Well, we can either have this debate on the assumption that people are entering into the debate in good faith, or we can be cynical and constantly accuse anybody that is actually asking for the best possible deal for our country of being unpatriotic. I mean, my colleagues in the Labour Party are going into this process with the best intentions of the country at heart. What we have seen is a Conservative party over years now that's been putting narrow party interests ahead of the national interest. Enough of that. We have had enough of it. We in Parliament need to have the facts at our disposal so that we can take a vote on what is the most important negotiation for generations in this country, and it is absolutely unacceptable that the government is once again playing narrow party politics. Theresa May is imprisoned by the hard right of her party, and these people cannot be allowed anymore to take decisions which will affect the future of our country for generations to come.
Well, isn't that just typical? And Labour have done absolutely nothing to help Brexit. They've expressed every concern, and they've made up all sorts of fictions about things that will go wrong if we leave without a big agreement and a partnership agreement. And they constantly misrepresent the WTO option, which is a series of agreements at international level which regulate our trade and mean that the rest of the EU cannot give us worse terms than they give the rest of the world. And we know exactly how that works, because that's how we have to trade with the rest of the world at the moment, all the time we're in the EU. So they just scaremonger the whole time because they're out to thwart the will of the British people.
Hang on, wait a minute. Liam Fox is one of the ministers giving evidence to a select committee this morning, and he has just said that the EU's language of wishing to punish the UK is regrettable. Is that what you're getting from the EU, that they want to punish the UK?
Well, I've heard some people from the EU institutions make that comment. I hope it isn't the general view, because it would be self-defeating. The people they will punish most will be all the food exporters from the continent into Europe who have a massive trade surplus with us, and they will be the one bit that will be affected by a WTO option, because we will put very big tariffs on them.
Do you think the UK is being punished by the EU?
Just one quick point on WTO, a very specific example, Dover. I'm a member of the Brexit Select Committee. We went to visit Dover. They said 2 minutes more on the processing of the 10,000 heavy goods vehicles that come through Dover equals a 13-mile tailback. So
there goes another silly
very
scare,
specific.
you know.
The only country in the world that trades only on WTO terms is Mauritania. Is that really where the United Kingdom wants to go? On the point of the EU, look, the EU is more united than it has been for a very long time. Brexit, ironically, has united the EU. They have an overriding concern, which is to protect the integrity of the single market. And it's perfectly logical for them to take a position in the Brexit negotiations which defends that overriding concern. What we have had from the British government is an utterly shambolic approach to these negotiations, with different cabinet ministers not even agreeing with themselves half the time, undermining Theresa May constantly. It's clear that the Conservative government is no longer capable of negotiating on this basis. I think that Labour should table a motion of no confidence in the government's complete inability to negotiate a Brexit deal that defends the interests and livelihoods of the British
Labour
people.
calls that supporting Britain.
I do just want to ask you briefly,
unbelievable.
as MPs, all these sexual harassment allegations flying around, what do you think needs to be done to regulate or to respond to those properly?
Well, serious allegation has to be investigated properly and appropriate
Do you
action
think the
taken.
structures are sufficient here at Westminster?
Well, I look forward to hearing what they want to propose. I'm sure there will be improvements in structures in the main parties and probably in Parliament as a whole, and I'm sure people are working on it.
It's awful what's happening. We need to have a proper independent system set up, as in any other organisation, where you have proper HR processes and people can, who have been victims of abuse can go with total anonymity through a proper whistleblowing process. And it's very regrettable that that hasn't been put in place until now, and I really hope that that will be the outcome of these awful events that we're seeing at the moment.
You didn't frankly have the balls to put country before party.